In this video, we will talk about the last week of Jesus' life, because in the Synoptic Gospels, it's the last week of his life that we have the most material on. Remember, Jesus is the Greek word for God saves. It's a translation of the Hebrew word Joshua, which also means God saves. The evangelists, or the evangelons, the synoptic writers, have been telling us the good news that the Messiah has come. We have very little about Jesus' early life, but what I'd like to do today is start with a week out before Easter on Palm Sunday. Jesus has finally told his disciples, his learners, that he's going to go into Jerusalem, the capital city, and pronounce himself Messiah. It was a well-timed week because it's the week of Passover. Remember, we talked about that when we talked about the Psalms, that once a year, the whole country of Israel went up to Jerusalem for this special annual feast. So the city would be packed full. And the disciples said, "This is great. Finally, Jesus is going to reveal himself as the Messiah." Home base for the week will be a little village of Bethany, where Jesus has been staying with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. It's about 1.5 miles away from Jerusalem. So on Palm Sundays, the disciples act like evangelons. They go ahead and they get the people out and stage a parade. People throw their palm branches on the road. They throw down their robes because the Messiah is coming. But remember that antithesis I was talking to you about that kind of energizes all the Gospels? Here we see it again on Palm Sunday. Jesus doesn't come into town on a white horse, as any political, military leader or hero would have done. He comes into town on a donkey or a foal of a mare, a colorless, drab, domesticated service animal. And they're disappointed. Further, we're told that Jesus doesn't come into town on the main road through the main gate, but he comes by the other way, the sheep gate. Let's unpack that for just a second because it's an important brushstroke. Because people were coming to Jerusalem for Passover, they would have to prepare a sacrifice. But when you're climbing up a mountain for 3 days, how do you take a sheep with you without having it get bloodied or unclean or dirtied, such that you couldn't sacrifice it properly in the temple when the time of the feast came? So what the temple authorities said was, hey guys, just leave your sheep at home, and when you get to Jerusalem, we'll sell you your sacrifice. Well, guess what happened to the price of sheep being sold in the temple during the week of Passover? It skyrocketed. Some scholars think up to 30 shekels of silver. Incidentally, remember that number and that price. And secondly, what happened to people when they traveled to Jerusalem, they got to the temple to go buy their overpriced sheep. They would give them their shekels, and the temple changers would go, "Oh, but these shekels are from Nazareth. Those aren't good here in Jerusalem. You first need to go change your Nazareth shekels to Jerusalem shekels." Well, guess what happened? In that exchange, they extorted the monetary exchange first, and then you had to buy this overpriced sheep. We'll get to that tomorrow because Jesus will see that and confront it. But the reason I tell you that now on Palm Sunday is that when the priests received their shipment of sheep that would be sacrificed, they didn't receive that shipment through the main street of the city. It would have been a mess. It would have been noisy. People could have stole their sheep. Instead, they received the sheep that they would use for sacrifice through the sheep gate. So Jesus coming in through the sheep gate has huge symbolic importance. He will be the perfect lamb sacrificed on Friday. That Sunday, Jesus goes back to Bethany, home base. On Monday, Confrontation Day, he comes back to the temple and confronts that whole racket I told you about. He flips over the money changers' tables. He said, "You guys have turned my father's house into a den of thieves." He says this whole place is like a whitewashed sepulcher. Sepulcher is a fancy name for a tomb. On the outside, it's all this pretty white marble. On the inside, it's just decaying, rotting flesh. He's not making friends and influencing people. On Tuesday, I know different gospels will put this at different places in the week and with different characters, but for this lecture, let's just put the next event on Tuesday at the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. Martha is maybe the only character who understands what Jesus is doing this week, and she says, "Hey guys, we've got to get a gift together." And so she rounds up enough money from the community to buy a bottle of pure nard and presents it to Jesus in an alabaster jar. Very expensive gift. Today, about $20,000. But then she purposefully dumps it on Jesus' feet. And the learners, the disciples, go berserk, especially the treasurer, Judas. He says, "Martha, this was dumb. Think what we could have done with all that money. Instead, you just wasted it." And Jesus says, "You leave her alone. She's done a beautiful thing. The poor you will always have with you. Me, you only have this once." And I like to think what's so beautiful about that gift, pure nard, by the way, is very potent in its smell. It was used for burial because it could even mask the smell of death. I think it's beautiful because maybe, just maybe, when Jesus went to the cross on Friday, he was denuded, robbed of his dignity, his clothes, his everything. Took nothing with him to the cross. Save, perhaps, the smell of pure nard. Wednesday, Jesus leaves again from Bethany, his home base, to go back to the temple. It's teaching day. The other priests and teachers, the rabbis, are getting not a little jealous of Jesus because he's teaching as one who had authority. And all the people were going to him during this Passover time, now that the city's getting even more packed with visitors. And so the priest said, "We need to publicly humiliate him. Let's test out this new rabbi." So they ask him a question. "Hey, Jesus, if you're so smart, of all the law," and remember, there were 614 Old Testament laws, "what's the greatest?" See why that's a setup? Pick any one law of 614 and you could come back with, well, what about 613 others? Jesus takes the bait and he says, "I'll tell you what the greatest law is. The greatest law is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength." Notice that that's a vertical law, comma, and a second is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself, horizontal. Love God, look up, look aside, and love your neighbor. And then he said, all the law hangs on these two. And I'll let you ponder that image and that very beautiful word choice of Jesus. They're stunned, but now Jesus has to say one more sentence that gets him in more trouble. And then he says, "And by the way, that, loving God and loving your neighbor, is more important than all your sacrifices." Well, now they've had it, because Jesus has just already demolished the sacrificial system with the temple on Monday, and now he's kind of publicly saying this whole thing is a racket. It's good for nothing. And he says he's a rabbi. So the priests of the temple said, "We got to shut this down, especially on the eve of Passover." And they go to work. Thursday is the actual day of Passover. Now I'm going to tell you how Passover should have gone, and then I'll tell you how Jesus changed it up to see why it was so scandalous. Passover should have gone that what they did is they said, when you come to town, everybody, you need to encamp with your people. It's like a big family reunion. So all the Smiths over here, circle your tents and your wagons, and all the Engels over here, and circle your tents and wagons. because you celebrated Passover feast with your family. Passover was a meal that reenacted for them the events of leaving Egypt and their salvation back to the promised land. So you would gather with your family, you'd have this meal. It was centered around four, I'll call them toasts. The first toast, they raise their glass and they say, "We are Israel. Let's drink to that." And to remind them of their beginning of slavery and distress in Egypt and their tears, they'll serve bitter herbs and salt water, kind of as an appetizer. And then they said, "But we were delivered, and we were delivered by the blood of the Lamb." And here the lamb that was sacrificed in the temple would be served. The other codicil the leaders made during Passover is that you can't have 4 million people going to the temple, the size of a maybe 4 tennis courts side by side. So 4 million people with sheep and knives and blood. So what they said is, from each of those camps, those family reunions, just send the eldest dad, the patriarch, and his eldest son. They come, they can sacrifice the lamb. The priest would sacrifice it, kill it by bleeding at the blood altar, burn some of its flesh. The priest was allowed to keep some. That's how they lived at the temple. And then the rest of the lamb was taken back, and those then in your camp could participate vicariously as though they had gone to the temple. So that lamb now was served. And then the next cup was, and remember that we were led to a land of milk and honey. And so dessert was served. You might guess, milk and honey and cream and sweet, beautiful stuff to remind them of the land they were brought to. And the final cup, and here's to the day when all of Israel will be gathered back in the city with the Messiah, never have to leave again. And after dinner, the men would go outside and pray. Okay, now what did Jesus do? Jesus totally changed it up. The first thing is so big and so obvious that everybody misses it. He should have gone to the camp of the house of David and his father Joseph. Instead, he rounds up his learners and rents a room, as if to say their bond is something other than blood. And then they get to that room. It happens to be on a second floor, which is why it's called the upper room. And the learners, because they know they're going to have a dinner, they're walking around in togas and sandals. They didn't eat at dinner tables, remember? They ate on the floor around a rug. You always washed your feet. That was a very polite thing to do. Feet were unclean, and you might literally have your feet in your neighbor's face when you're reclining at a low table or a rug. Feet were untouchable, so you had servants do that. But when the disciples came, it was Jesus, a rabbi, who condescended to wash their feet. And then he said, "And I give you a command. I command you to serve and to love as you're seeing me serve and love." In Latin, the word command is mandatum, which is why Christians call this Maundy Thursday, the day Jesus gave a command. According to Matthew, then, they follow the Passover meal called a Seder. They have the first cup. They get to the second cup, but the learners look around and there is no sacrificed lamb there. In their confusion, Jesus instead takes bread and says, "This is my body, which will be broken for you. Do it in remembrance of me." And then he takes that cup and he says, "And this cup is a new covenant in my blood. Do this in remembrance of me." What is Jesus saying, of course? He's saying that he is the lamb that will be sacrificed, which implies he is the one who can forgive sins, which implies that he is the Messiah. And when they get to the last cup, Jesus says, "And I'm not raising the last cup because my work isn't finished, but I promise you that someday when my work is finished and my whole kingdom is gathered in the new heavens and the new earth, then we'll raise that last cup." Which incidentally why is so significant that the Bible ends then, of course, with this picture of a heavenly banquet where Jesus raises that last cup with all the redeemed. The disciples then, following custom, after the meal, go out to pray. They go to the Garden of Gethsemane. The priests, who are upset with Jesus' action the whole week now, have arranged with the treasurer that this would be a good way and time to grab Jesus to take him for a trial. Charges are heresy. He's not respecting any of the laws, any of the traditions, and he's claiming to be God who can forgive sins. They come across Jesus and his learners in the garden. The treasurer, Judas, points Jesus out by giving him a kiss, and Jesus is taken away to something called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is, if you will, the little executive committee of the temple, for lack of a better word, the little council. And it's chaired by a guy named Caiaphas. And they put Jesus up on these charges of heresy. They find him guilty. And according to the Old Testament, the charges of heresy, of blasphemy against God, is death. But they're religious officials. They can't impose the sentence. So all they can do is go to the government and ask them to impose the sentence, just like we would today. If any religious community has a member who has transgressed somehow in the law, they can't set up an electric chair in the parking lot and execute people, right? We would have to take them to a civic trial and say to the government, we have a guilty person, you need to take it from here. Well, this is exactly what the Sanhedrin did. They were wise. They waited till now Friday. They didn't wake the governor up in the middle of the night. But they come to Pontius Pilate in the morning of Friday now, and they say, we found this guy guilty. We want you to carry out our sentence, which is execution. And by the way, it happens to be Friday, a day when Rome ordinarily takes care of all of its criminals at noon. Pontius Pilate looks at this rabbi and his town full of 4 million Jews. And he says to himself, I don't want to start killing Jews. They could riot, and I don't got the Roman guard enough to contain a riot of 4 million. He says, go away. I don't want this. And they won't go away. They say, we want you to crucify this guy. Pilate then remembers another ace in his pocket that the governor had during Passover. And that is, in order to keep those 4 million Jews relatively quiet and happy while the nervous Romans are outnumbered, every year at Passover, the governor, in a kind of a nice token, would say to the people, you know how you're here at Passover, remembering how you were slaves, but God freed you? We get that. And to kind of celebrate that with you, every year I can take a Jewish criminal, and I will, and release him. That'll make you happy. It reenacts what you're doing here. It lets you know that we understand what you're doing, and it keeps everybody sort of happy with Rome. So Pilate says, aha, go get me the most hardened criminal in jail right now. We're going to play this card. They bring him Barabbas, a known killer. And he says, surely they would rather have a rabbi go than a known killer go and be amongst them again. But the crowd doesn't relent. They say, release Barabbas. And now Pilate has painted himself in a corner. He literally washes his hands of it. It says that famous line, what is truth? He releases Barabbas and says to Jesus and the guards, take him away. We're pretty sure that originally in Old English, this day was called God Friday because of what will happen next, but later it was kind of corrupted to the word good, which in a way kind of makes sense too, because for a Christian now, what Jesus will do was good for our redemption. The Romans take him away and they execute Jesus in the Roman manner of crucifixion. The criminal would take just the crossbeam of the cross from Jerusalem to the hill outside of the walls. The poles were already set in the ground. The hands were nailed to the crossbeam and they were hoisted up onto the poles. And if that were done alone, death would come rather quickly by asphyxiation and bleeding. Rome didn't want that. They wanted their death to be humiliating and drug out as torture. So they put a little platform where the feet could sustain the weight of the criminal to prolong death. And you're thinking, well, if I was a criminal then, I would kick my feet out, get it over with. No, because what Rome did, that's why they nailed also the feet onto that little platform, to make the death heinous and long and torturous. We're told that by 3 in the afternoon, Jesus was already dead. We know this because by 3 in the afternoon, the Romans are looking at their watch going, it's going to be sunset and the end of my work week and I want to get home. So what they would do then is walk around with an iron pipe and break the kneecaps. So people would collapse and die and they could be done with their job for the day. They went to Jesus, he was already dead. But to double check, they speared him in the side. We're told that the sky went dark, there was an earthquake, and that 4-finger thick curtain in the temple tore in two. Just a second about that. Remember that temple curtain hid from people the presence of God, as symbolized by the Ark of the Covenant. Outside of the temple courts, people were making sacrifice after sacrifice to appease God. They never saw God's holiness because nobody could ever make a perfect sacrifice. When Jesus died, that temple curtain was torn in two and everybody saw the holiness of God, and if you will, the holiness of God spilled out to the whole world. And a Christian would say that's because the final perfect sacrifice was finally made in Jesus. It's 3 in the afternoon. The bodies were always given over to the women of the family so they could prepare it for burial. Criminals would have been buried in the ground, but there was a man there, Joseph of Arimathea, not Joseph of Nazareth, Jesus' dad, but Joseph of Arimathea. We're told he was a rich man, not because Jesus just likes rich people, but because that tells us what kind of grave then he offered to the women. He said, look, it's almost dark. Why don't you let Jesus, I have a new grave. And because he was a rich man, we know that he wasn't buried in the earth. He was buried in a tomb in a mountain. The women take Jesus there, and because the Jewish Sabbath, Saturday, begins at sunset the night before, one of those 614 Old Testament laws says you can't touch dead bodies on the holy Sabbath day. So the Jewish women said, we have just enough time to get Jesus into the tomb, and we'll come back on the first day of the week, our Sunday, when we can finish the job, and it won't be unlawful for us to touch a dead body. So they put Jesus in the tomb, they wrap him in linen, and they say, we'll come back. The Jew says you better roll a large stone in front of it and seal it and put 2 guards, because we know what they're going to do. They're going to steal that body and then say he was resurrected from the dead like he predicted. So they put the stone there, the 2 guards, it's sunset. Now it's Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath. You'll love this. What happens on Saturday? Absolutely nothing. Because it's the Jewish Sabbath. Any questions? And just as the Jewish Sabbath begins at sunset the night before, it ends at sunrise of the next day. So now Sunday at sunrise, the women go back to the tomb to finish the job of preparing Jesus for burial. You might know that morning as Easter morning, and that's where we'll pick it up at the next lecture. I know this has been a lot of material, so you do very well to slowly review each day of the week again. And as you do, remember to place names like Caiaphas and Barabbas, Judas, Pontius Pilate, Joseph of Arimathea, Martha, Mary, Lazarus. And then remember ideas like the sheep gate, how the Passover feast was supposed to go, but how Jesus did it. Remember the 30 shekels of silver, the cost of a sheep, what it inflated to that day, and by the way, what the Sanhedrin paid Judas as his price of betrayal. Remember the curtain and why it was torn in two. Remember, what does a rabbi mean? 614 Old Testament laws, the alabaster jar of nard, the donkey, not the white horse. Bethany was the hometown, okay? I know that's a lot of material. This is the center point of the whole course, of course, about Jesus. So you might want to review this lecture in all those terms in your handout. And I'll see you next to talk about Easter, the first day of the week, what happens next.